Hey guys, in this video, I wanted to go over a unique programming strategy to manage fatigue that is different from a traditional deload called back-end deloads. So, how these mostly would differentiate between a normal deload versus back-end deloads is really where the deload is placed. So, in this example that I have, basically traditional deloads reduce volume and intensity after you have your speaker training. So, say that you have a 4-week training block. Usually, you will have a deload week following the highest intensity week because there's a point in training where our fatigue crosses over with our fitness, our ability to get stronger, and we need to drop down that fatigue in order so that we can keep getting stronger, hopefully get stronger than we were the last time that we got to those heavier weights and have our estimated 1 rep max just continually trend up block after block. And so what this would kind of look like is a traditional deload. So you have your week 5, you have your heaviest week of training, and you have a reduction of volume and intensity. So you can see here, I'm cutting off some sets, cutting off some reps in some cases, and we're cutting off the load used. And this is just a way for us to drop down that fatigue, like I said, so we can get stronger in the next training block. Now, one of the main issues with this is that sometimes people really notice that their back down work starts to suffer after they have a heavier intensity lift. And this is where fatigue management really comes into play because we're trying to sort of get in front of that where we can actually make sure our fatigue doesn't get too high or it takes longer for us to get out of that fatigue hole because especially as you start getting stronger, having heavier absolute loads, this is when you would have maybe more credence towards doing a back-end deload, or even just in general, if you you notice that your back work is really hard, it might be just as hard as the top sets, even like if you're trying to have like that, similar progression every single week, where you might need to be like, okay, we need to have a back-end deload. What this basically would look like is on the week 4 or heaviest week of training, whatever that is for you, we would still have our peak intensity exposure go up, but we would essentially just lower down, the volume or the intensity used on that week 4. And this is really going to allow you to be able to, I guess, stay in front of that fatigue curve and not have like as long of like a period of time where you're feeling crappy in training and it takes longer for you to dissipate down that fatigue. One other benefit of this strategy is that sometimes you can notice that you get somewhat of a peaking effect, especially if you have your heavier lifts later on in that week, because you're lowering down that intensity and that volume in some cases. So in this example, there's really no volume reduction, but again, sometimes the intensity, the exposure being lower is enough to really bring people back to life. Sometimes you have a combination of the two. It really just depends on how you feel after your deload week or after you implement this strategy. And this is something that I've been using myself for a long time. It just helps me feel a little bit better. But mostly it's just a reduction of volume because as long as I'm not going to like an RPE 10, I usually feel like I can progress my absolute intensity a lot. But I also know like if I am doing heavier loads and my RPEs are higher, that fatigue cost is higher. I'm getting more stimulus and I don't need to do as much volume. This is just a really good way for me to sort of, stay in front of that. And so kind of like what I said here, in general, these are some general guidelines. I'll link this in the link to the post I have here in the description box below. But I wanted to go over what this would look like for one of my clients, Joey, who basically he told me this block that after he did this squat set. Now it was an RP 10, it was an overshoot, but in general, like if you look over like the trends on his week 4s, he starts getting pretty disproportionately fatigued as background works feels like pretty hard. And so this is where we would implement that back-end deload strategy, where essentially if you look at what he's doing compared to last week, I am lowering down the volume and the intensity just because he tends to need that, even though he's not like as strong of an absolute load lifter. He tends to really benefit from this. And you can see, I take off a little bit different loads for, the bench press versus deadlift and squat. In some cases, like in this next block too, you can see like that. And actually, I'm going to deload his deadlift a little bit more. So, about 87% of what he did, but we're keeping that peak intensity exposure high. Now, sometimes I might also say on that last, secondary squat session, because usually how the training works is whatever you're doing prior to your primary squat day is what's going to determine how it feels, because you're just trying to bridge that gap of stimulus to fatigue so that you don't detrain, you also aren't getting too fatigued. I might lower down maybe like a set right here on his squat, and maybe a set on his leg extensions. So his quads might feel a little bit more fresh. You can just sort of get a peak that way. I think deloads are a really great way for you to sort of understand, especially if you're doing it like in a way like this works or whatever, you can see like, okay, like maybe this is like a way for me to like trial like how I peak. Like sometimes do a strategy for like, not like back-end deload, but like preemptively deloading, like maybe like on a week 3, you lower down the volume a little bit, but keeping the intensity a little bit higher. And then that gives them like a peak into that last week. There's lots of different ways to deload, but it basically just depends on what you're trying to get out of the lifter. But a back-end deload could be a really, really great strategy if you are noticing that, like I say right here, you are getting disproportionately fatigued from higher peak intensities, your back down work suffers, and then the overall fatigue cost of that workout gets too high, and it just takes you a longer time to lower down that fatigue. So hopefully this was helpful. Like how to back-end deload. Again, it's the same thing as a deload week, but you just do it on the earlier week. You maintain that peak intensity, but then you lower down the volume and or the intensity on your accessory movements and your down sets, and just get ahead of that fatigue trend. Just try out several different things, and if you guys are looking for a coach that can really help you figure out like what's the best strategy for me to manage my fatigue, especially as you get stronger, because fatigue management becomes more of an important variable limiting factor as people get stronger. Just links down below for a coaching application. I'll have to hop on a free 30-minute call. We can talk about your goals, what's holding up, and I can see if you're a good fit. Totally free. But yeah, I'll also link this post in the description box below. If you guys have any questions, ask down too in the comments.